Hello, and thank you for the invitation to come speak to USAW. Thanks to Craig and all the other folks at the Utah Avalanche Center running USAW. Tonight I'm going to talk about a deadly US Avalanche season and really about how that season was an intersection between an unstable snowpack and the global pandemic. And before I get rolling, I want to thank my co-authors. First is Ethan Green. He's the one on the right, not the one in the middle. Spencer Logan and Simon Trotman, who works with me at the National Avalanche Center. And I'd also like to thank Eric Peich, who did a lot of the first work on the ages of the avalanche victims, and also Mark Staples, who worked with Evelyn Lees on some of this original data looking at folks who are traveling alone. So to give you all some context, last season was bad, but it wasn't completely unprecedented. We've had other years with 35 and 36 fatalities, although those years we actually had quite a bit fewer people in the backcountry. Over the long term, our fatalities are roughly stable or even slightly dropping. Combined with our increased use, this means that our fatality rate has decreased significantly. But what was remarkable about this year was not so much the total number of fatalities, but rather when they occurred. So on this graph here on the horizontal axis, we have the date of the season. On the vertical axis, we have the cumulative fatalities. The three lines here, the yellow, red, and brown line, that's the 75th percentile, median, and 25th percentile of the last 10 years. And so that's sort of our normal range. And this blue line was last year. And you can see we sort of bumped along in the normal range right to the end of January. And then boom, we had this huge spike of avalanche fatalities in February. And so I'd like to explore really what caused this. Well, the first is the people. During COVID, I think as everybody here knows, folks flocked to the mountains, they packed the ski hills and the trailheads. And here's just an example of some of the map.
You know you're parked right in the avalanche path, right?
Yeah, it's all good.
So it's all good when you're parked in an avalanche path, I guess, right? Well, anecdotally, we really saw dramatic increases in backcountry use. Sales of backcountry skis were up 140%. Web traffic at our avalanche centers was up anywhere from 40 to 90%. Avalanche.org, the web traffic was up 43%. The Gallatin National Forest Avalanche Center videos doubled to 1.2 million views over the season. And you probably know that the Utah Avalanche Center had to double the capacity of their website. And so the bottom line is that use appears to have increased anywhere from 50 to 100% in many areas over just a single year. So while the skin tracks filled up and our summits got crowded, we asked ourselves how these crowds would intersect with our season's snowpack conditions. Lots of early season media wanted us to project doom and gloom, but really it was going to be the snowpack that helped determine the trajectory of the season. And it turns out we didn't have to wait too long to recognize what was happening with our snowpack. Back in October and November, we received early snow across much of the West, and then the snowpack stayed thin for much of December and into January, resulting in widespread depth hoar. And yes, this is a full depth snow pit in Montana in early December. So it was just a matter of time before we loaded up that snowpack, and from late January to late February, there were a series of storms across the West. Bridger Bowl in Montana had the most February snowfall since they started keeping records in 1968. Jackson Hole had the highest 30-day snowfall of any 30-day period in their records. And so it was no surprise that we ended up with lots of avalanches and avalanche accidents on all types of slopes. These slopes included big avalanche paths and small slopes. And this is just a graphic of the avalanche danger and how the avalanche danger progressed over the season. And so the colors just indicate whether it was low, moderate, considerable, higher extreme danger. And we have the date at the top, and you can see right coming into the start of February, our avalanche danger starts to elevate across large areas of the West. We have periods where there's lots of high avalanche danger, and really in many areas, the avalanche danger doesn't really fall below considerable for pretty much the entire month. And even right in here, we see the extreme avalanche danger in Utah there in the middle of the month. And again, one of the things that was so tricky about the snowpack was that we just kept loading it up with enough storms that throughout the month of February, we had unstable snow across a very wide area. Then by early March, where we are right now, we see things start to stabilize. So before the winter, we wondered who would get caught in avalanches this season. Would they be young and inexperienced, as many in the media were forecasting? And we had some hints from Colorado in the spring of 2020, where the CAIC was finding that the people that were getting caught in avalanches were actually more experienced than they expected. Of course, some avalanche victims were skiers. We had avalanche victims that were snowmobilers. When we look at the activity that folks were involved with, we can see that we had skiers, snowboarders, snowshoers, climbers, snowmobilers. But if we break it down by motorized and non-motorized, about 25% of the people were motorized and 75% non-motorized. And if we look at the data for the prior 10 years, that number was around 30%. So about the same variation, or about the same proportion rather. We wondered if the victims would primarily be uneducated side country users, as some predicted, or would they be people traveling in the backcountry? And so if we look at the backcountry versus lift access backcountry or side country, we see that 17% of the people were in the lift access backcountry of our avalanche victims. And that compares to lift access backcountry or side country skiers comprising 28% of the victims for the prior 10 years. So we actually had a larger proportion of people who died in backcountry accidents versus side country. Would these people be traveling alone or in groups? Well, this year we had about 11% traveling solo. And if we look at the data that Evelyn and Mark pulled together from 2009 to 2018, there were about 12% rather of our avalanche victims were traveling solo. So again, very similar to the last 10 years. It felt like we had a lot of multi-victim avalanche accidents this year, with 2, 3, and even 4 people getting killed in the same avalanche. So we compared this year to previous years. And here along the horizontal axis, we have the avalanche year. The blue dots over here are this past year. And then on the vertical axis rather is the number of avalanche victims. And we can see that, yes, we had, one accident with 4, a couple accidents with 3, another accident with 2, most accidents, 1 person. It wasn't completely out of the ordinary in comparison to previous years. However, over a 6-day period in February, we had 2 3-person fatalities and 1 4-person fatality. And that onslaught of 10 fatalities in that 6-day period made it feel like we had more multi-victim accidents. How about the ages of our avalanche victims? Well, they varied. We had a really wide range, varying from 19 to 69 years old. If we look at a histogram of all 37 avalanche victims, the ages are skewed towards the older users. The median age of this year's avalanche victims is 44 years old. Now, if we compare that to the 30-year median, the 30-year median is actually 34. So this year, our avalanche victims tended to be older than in previous years. So what can we sum up about our typical avalanche victim from last season? Compared to recent history, that person was similar in terms of being motorized or non-motorized users, similar in terms of whether they were traveling solo or with a partner. Compared with recent history, they were skewed towards more backcountry users rather than side country, and also skewed towards older users, generally with more experience in their sport. So what stands out? Well, the main thing that stands out when you look over a lot of these avalanche accidents is really a tendency to underestimate the terrain given the snowpack conditions. This is an accident that you're probably well aware of. It killed a 57-year-old who was very familiar with this terrain and who had skied it many times. However, he failed to match his terrain choice to the day's avalanche conditions. Originally, they had planned on skiing this ridge line, was my understanding, and he decided that he wanted to go out onto the slope. His partner was still planning on skiing down the ridge line, but when he went out on the slope, he then triggered the avalanche. A lot of people are asking, what role did COVID have in our avalanche season last year? And I just want to give you a quote from the survivor of this avalanche. He said, "I want to share my belief that COVID had an impact on this accident. I realize now that I am exhausted from the 10 months of near constant stress COVID brings with worrying about my family, my friends, my work, etc. Plus financial stress, school closures, no physical contact with family members and friends, and so forth. As a result, my typical training, motivation, and mental reflection has been much less than a normal fall and winter." So I think that really was kind of an underpinning for the entire season. And this is another avalanche accident that probably most of you are familiar with, but it's another accident where the terrain was really underestimated. The avalanche danger was high, but the two parties had converged on the slope, feeling like it was more or less a safer option, at least for that day. And at least one of those parties had skied it on days when the avalanche danger was high in the past. But when we look more carefully at that slope, of course, we can see that, you know, in large part, it is steeper than 30 degrees. So it is avalanche terrain. And of course, this tragic accident resulted in 4 fatalities. Finally, I'd just like to offer that 36 fatalities in a season, or 37 fatalities rather in a season, is an unimaginable loss. And we certainly wish we could prevent every single fatality. And that said, things could have been a lot worse. We had a lot of amazing saves, including from this avalanche near Cook City in Montana. And we had an unprecedented number of backcountry users last season and widespread unstable conditions. So despite the fatalities, I am incredibly proud of the work done by our avalanche forecasters and our other avalanche workers, the entire avalanche industry, the educators, and without their tireless efforts, I think things would have been a lot worse. And with that, I'll just say thanks, and I'd be happy to open it up to some questions.
Hey, Karl, nice to see you. Welcome, welcome.
Greg.
Of course, we would always love to see you here in person, but I know that, you know, times are what they are, right? We're just grateful to have you, as the College of Avalanche Knowledge says. Thanks for joining us. And I've got a couple questions in the queue. And first off is, why do you think there were more mass casualty incidents last year? Why were there more multiple fatalities involved? Any insight on that?
You know, if we compare it to past years, we had other years that weren't that dissimilar to last year. Why did we have more last year? In some ways, I feel like it was just bad luck. You know, we had the 3-person fatality up in Alaska. We had, of course, the 4-person fatality there in Wilson Glades, which was kind of bad luck that you ended up, you know, with so many people on the same slope. And then we had a 3-person fatality in Colorado where people had skied into a gully and were like kind of all in this gully, but kind of off what they thought was steeper terrain when the avalanche was triggered and came down into that terrain trap. So some, in some ways, I think it's just sort of bad luck. But it does remind us that, especially in a season like last season with such unstable conditions, you just always have to be super careful about only putting one person on a slope at a time. And that's a good rule, no matter what your snowpack's looking like and no matter what day of the year it is.
Right. So maybe those peculiar or unusual snowpack factors lent a little bit of a hand in skewing our perception, and maybe some of those terrain rituals or travel rituals that we should be really honing in on. And maybe that shows a little bit more that if we tend to slide off of that it puts us at a greater risk.
Absolutely. I think with some of this, we had conditions that a lot of people that are out there skiing may not have seen before. Like if you haven't been out 10, 15, 20 years, depending on what part of the country you're in, you might not have seen a snowpack that looked like that, or an instability that lasted as long as that did. And so, the kind of strategies you might have employed in the past that worked perfectly well just might not have worked last year because of just how unstable the snow was and how long that instability lasted.
All right. Yeah, great follow-up there. And then let me ask you, Karl, gender-wise, what was the gender breakdown of the victims last year? Is it in line with things that we've seen in prior years?
That's a really good question. I did not break the data down by gender. So yeah, just thinking off the top of my head, I can't really answer that.
Got it. You talked a little bit about kind of this, the age group of the users. And we're wondering, any idea why more experienced users were involved last year? And do you think that this is a trend we might be seeing in years to come? So it seems like we kind of had some guardrails with some of the unfortunate fatalities of older, more experienced users. What do you think of that trend?
Yeah, I think there could be a couple of different things. One thing could have been that with COVID, and certainly I know an experienced user in Jackson Hole, when I gave this talk to the YSAW, said that he had his places that he usually went, but they were so crowded this year that he kept pushing further and further back, further away. And so maybe some of the more experienced people ended up on slopes that had fewer skiers on them, or hadn't been skied earlier in the season, or something like that. Or, so that's one possibility. Another possibility is just that, sometimes when people have been skiing for a long time, they get sort of these rules of thumb that they follow. And those rules of thumb have kept them alive for a long time. But maybe those rules of thumb, maybe they got lucky a few years, and maybe those rules of thumb just didn't really hold this year. And I think what it points to is that, if you've been out for a really long time and done a whole lot of backcountry skiing, but maybe your avalanche class is getting further and further and further in the rearview mirror, you might think about going and taking another avalanche class and getting refreshed. There's a lot of new information out there, and we all forget stuff over time. So, and really, like, everyone's really got to focus on the basics. You got to focus on avalanche terrain. Are we an avalanche terrain? Are we not an avalanche terrain? And is the terrain that we're choosing today appropriate for the conditions that we have?
Wow, great answer. So maybe sort of that overlap of unusual snowpack, and then users who, snow is a very forgiving medium, and it allows us a lot of mistakes. So maybe we've been making solid mistakes given those snowpack types of layerings and hazards that we're used to. And this year, everything just came together in a very unfortunate, point of reference. Everything came together in a very dangerous stage.
And it really all came together in February. I mean, we didn't have that many fatalities before February. We didn't have that many fatalities afterwards. I mean, and like I said, each one of these fatalities, of course, we sort of talk about them like they're these numbers, but in reality, it's these people and these webs of connections, and each one is so crushing. And so, we want to try and prevent every single one. But when we look at the season, it really was that February that just, knocked things off the charts, which was.
Yeah, absolutely. And Karl, last night we had a really heavy night here. You saw a number of reflections on some of the accidents we saw here, family members here. And you're absolutely right. It's not a victim, it's a person, and a person is waiting for that person to get home. And super, super heavy. I'm glad that you touched on that. And while we're talking about people and users, did you see any percentages of backcountry users, motorized as opposed to non-motorized?
Yeah, when we looked at, you mean in terms of just the numbers of users that were out there?
And in terms of the fatalities that we saw?
Yeah, so about 25% of our fatalities were motorized users and 75% non-motorized. And that matches up quite closely with what we looked at over the prior 10 years. Over the prior 10 years, the number of motorized victims was 30%. So we're right about at that same, motorized versus non-motorized. And in terms of the actual numbers, we just don't have good numbers of how many people are out in the backcountry. We do know that, the people that were out sledding last year, you had a heck of a time finding sleds. There were, sled sales were way up, just like backcountry ski sales, and the trailheads were super packed. So just lots and lots of people out last year. And I think we're going to see the exact same thing this year, with lots of people in the backcountry.